That's the bit that excites me, is the idea of being able to bring some change. Not overly radical change, but changes that I think need to happen.
At exactly 6:30 in the morning, the palace confirmed what it had spent generations avoiding. The blot of the future king carried a truth buried for centuries, and when William read it, his body simply gave way. The envelope at dawn. The first thing that changed was the silence. Not the ordinary early morning quiet of Kensington Palace, but the kind that settles only after decisions have already been made. The corridors were awake before the sun rose on a cold February morning in early 2026, and the staff knew without being told that something irreversible had arrived. The envelope was not marked urgent. It did not need to be. Cream paper, heavy weight, no return address, only the royal cipher pressed faintly into the corner, as if even the paper itself was reluctant to announce its purpose. It passed through 3 hands before reaching Prince William, and each person who touched it felt the same tightening in the chest. This was not correspondence. This was confirmation. William was already awake when it arrived. He had not slept more than fragments for weeks. There had been meetings that were not recorded, briefings that never made it onto schedules, and a private request issued quietly through medical channels that did not belong to the National Health Service nor the palace physicians. The request had been simple in language and devastating in implication. A comprehensive genealogical and medical DNA analysis of Prince George of Cambridge. Not for scandal, not for succession challenges. That much had been made clear in the phrasing. This was about something else entirely, something older, something buried. William had known the answer was coming. What he had not prepared for was the finality of it. When he broke the seal, he did not sit down. He stood by the window, the winter light barely filtering through the bare branches beyond the lawn. The first paragraph confirmed authenticity. The second confirmed methodology. The third confirmed what the palace would later describe only as unexpected findings. He did not reach the fourth. His knees gave way before he realized his breath had stopped. The envelope slid from his hands and scattered across the floor like pages fleeing their own meaning. Down the corridor, a senior aide heard the sound of a body hitting the carpet and ran. By 7:15, the private physician was summoned. By 7:30, Catherine was ushered in before being told anything. By 8 o'clock, the king had been informed with a single sentence spoken over a secure line that carried no comfort. "It concerns George." That was all that needed to be said. By midday, the palace would release a statement confirming that recent genetic results related to Prince George had been reviewed and verified. It would stress transparency, responsibility, and care. It would say nothing of what those results actually meant, but inside the palace walls, a truth had already detonated, not about legitimacy, about inheritance of a different kind, and it had broken the Prince of Wales where he stood. The test that was never meant to exist. The origins of the test traced back to a conversation that was never recorded and never meant to leave the room in which it occurred. It happened in late October of the previous year, when the palace was already strained by quiet fears that never reached the press. The king's health reviews had become more frequent. William's schedule had tightened around his children with an intensity that advisors noticed but did not question. There was a sense that the future had begun arriving faster than anyone expected. It was during this period that a senior medical advisor who had served the crown across 3 reigns requested a private audience with the Prince of Wales. The request was framed as routine. The reality was anything but. The advisor spoke carefully. He always did. His words carried the weight of decades spent protecting truths rather than revealing them. He explained that while reviewing long archived biological records related to historical royal illnesses, he had noticed something unsettling, a pattern, not a scandal, not an affair, a genetic signature that appeared sporadically across centuries of royal documentation and then disappeared again, as if deliberately obscured. The advisor did not name it at first. He asked William if he believed the royal family truly understood its own medical history. William listened in silence. He had learned long ago that silence often revealed more than interruption. The advisor explained that certain traits historically attributed to stress, weakness, or temperament did not align with modern medical understanding. There were markers suggesting inherited conditions that had been mislabeled for generations. The reason they were never fully identified was simple. Genetic testing had never been allowed to advance far enough. Until now, the advisor made it clear that no one was suggesting wrongdoing. This was not about legitimacy or bloodline disputes. This was about knowledge. Knowledge that could matter for the health and safety of the next generation. William asked one question. Was this about George? The advisor hesitated before answering. That hesitation would later echo louder than any confirmation. He said that Prince George's recent routine pediatric screenings had returned a minor irregularity, nothing alarming on its own. But paired with the archived data, it formed a shape that could no longer be ignored. William did not immediately agree. He asked who would know. He asked how the data would be protected. He asked whether the results could ever be used against his son. The advisor answered each question without hesitation. The testing would be conducted privately. The data would remain sealed. The findings would be shared only with William, Catherine, and the king. There would be no public disclosure unless medically necessary. What he did not say was that once such knowledge existed, it could never truly be buried again. The test required approvals that did not exist on paper, a discrete sample collection, a genealogical comparison reaching back across centuries. It was not a single test, but a series of them conducted across independent laboratories whose names would never appear in any official record. William agreed, but not immediately. He went home that night and watched George sleep. He noticed the rise and fall of his chest, the soft clench of his small hand around the edge of the blanket. He thought of lineage not as crowns and thrones, but as responsibility carried silently from one generation to the next. When he gave his consent, it was with a single condition. No one else would be told until he was. The samples were collected under the guise of routine medical review. Catherine was informed only after the process had begun. She reacted not with fear, but with a quiet anger that surprised even William. Not at the test itself, but at the realization that questions about her child's body had existed without her knowledge. She demanded answers that could not yet be given. The weeks that followed were filled with waiting, not the anxious waiting of uncertainty, but the heavier kind that comes when one already senses the shape of the truth. The advisor checked in rarely. When he did, his tone remained measured. Too measured. By early December, the first results arrived. They were incomplete. They confirmed consistency across laboratories. They also suggested that the anomaly was not random. It was inherited. At that point, the king was informed. The conversation between father and son was brief and uncharacteristically devoid of ceremony. The king asked if the child was in danger. William answered that no one knew yet. The king then asked a question that surprised William. Has this happened before? The advisor later confirmed that it had. Not once, not twice, multiple times across royal history. Always emerging in early childhood, always managed quietly, always disappearing from public memory through reassignment, mislabeling, or in some cases strategic silence. What made George different was timing. Modern genetics could no longer look away. By January, the full sequencing was complete. The findings were reviewed and verified independently by specialists who did not know whose DNA they were analyzing. Each returned the same conclusion, phrased in careful academic language that nonetheless carried unmistakable weight. Prince George carried a rare inherited genetic marker associated with a condition historically misunderstood and deeply stigmatized within royal tradition. It was not life-threatening. It did not impair intelligence. It did not affect longevity. But it did challenge a myth the monarchy had built itself upon for generations. The myth of unbroken physical perfection as proof of divine continuity. The advisor explained that in earlier eras, children with similar markers were quietly redirected away from the line of succession, or their traits explained away as personality quirks or temporary illnesses. Records were altered. Narratives were rewritten. The crown endured because the truth remained fragmented. This time, fragmentation was impossible. William read the preliminary summary alone late one evening. Catherine sat nearby, pretending to read while watching his face change line by line. When he finally spoke, his voice did not shake. "They cannot take him." The advisor had anticipated that reaction. He explained that no one was suggesting removal. The law was clear. The line of succession was intact. There was no constitutional mechanism to alter it based on this information. But law had never been the only force governing the monarchy. Perception mattered, tradition mattered, fear mattered, and fear was already moving quietly through rooms where it had no name. The final report arrived in February, sealed with the highest level of confidentiality. It was that envelope that reached William at dawn. It was that confirmation that turned possibility into fact. What shattered him was not the science. It was the realization that the palace had known this could happen, that somewhere in locked archives decisions had once been made to protect the institution at the expense of children who could not defend themselves. William collapsed, not because of what his son was, but because of what the crown had been willing to erase. And now the truth had found its way back into the blood of the future king. There would be no erasing this time. The bloodline question. By the time Chapter 3 began unfolding, the palace had already split into two realities that could no longer be reconciled. In one reality, the monarchy functioned as it always had. Briefings continued. Engagements were planned. The public calendar moved forward with serene inevitability. Prince George smiled for the cameras and waved with the easy confidence of a child who had no idea that history was pressing its weight against his name. In the other reality, nothing was stable anymore. That reality lived behind closed doors and inside files that were never printed. It existed in whispers, exchanged only after phones were surrendered and rooms were swept twice. It existed in the careful avoidance of words like condition, defect, or weakness. It existed in a single phrase that no one wanted to say aloud. The bloodline question. It was the king who insisted that the phrase be acknowledged. He had lived long enough to know that unnamed fears were always the most dangerous. During a private council held 3 days after William's collapse, he asked his advisors to stop circling the truth. Is this about succession or survival? No one answered immediately. The legal position was straightforward. There was no constitutional threat, no statute, no precedent, no lawful mechanism that allowed genetic information to alter the line of succession. The monarchy had endured abdications, scandals, wars, and exile. It could endure this, but the king was not asking about law. He was asking about belief. For centuries, the crown had relied on an unspoken narrative. That continuity itself was proof that the blood of monarchs carried something rare and stable and chosen. It was a story reinforced through ceremony, symbolism, and silence. It did not need to be articulated because it was assumed. Now that assumption was under strain. The advisor explained that the genetic marker identified in George was not new to science, but its implications within royal history were profound. In modern terms, it was understood as a neurological variance that manifested differently depending on environment and support. In earlier centuries, it had been described as fragility, volatility, or in some cases moral failing. The language used to hide it had shifted, but the intent had remained the same: control the narrative, preserve the image. What troubled William was not how the palace might react now, but how it had reacted before. He demanded access to the restricted archives that documented historical cases. The request caused visible discomfort among senior officials. Those files were not meant to be revisited. They represented choices that modern sensibilities would not forgive. The king approved the access anyway. When William began reading, he felt as though he were walking through a long gallery of unnamed ghosts. There were references to royal children removed from public view, explanations of sudden illnesses, and quiet relocations to estates abroad. There were medical notes that used euphemisms where diagnoses should have been. There were correspondences between monarchs and advisors that framed children as liabilities rather than lives. None of the records were explicit. They did not need to be. The pattern was unmistakable. The bloodline had been curated. Catherine read the files beside him. She grew quiet, not with fear but with fury. At one point she closed a folder and said something William would never forget. They survived by sacrificing their own. That was the moment when the conversation shifted from management to morality. The palace was now faced with a choice that history had avoided by obscuring it: whether to continue protecting the institution at all costs, or to redefine what strength meant in a modern monarchy. The advisors split into factions, though no one acknowledged it openly. One group argued for absolute privacy. They insisted that disclosure of any kind would invite scrutiny not just of George but of every royal birth that came before him. They warned of endless speculation, legal challenges, and the erosion of mystique. Another group argued for controlled transparency. They believed that secrecy was no longer viable in an age where information surfaced regardless of permission. They pointed out that George's condition posed no threat to his capacity to rule. That honesty could strengthen rather than weaken public trust. William listened to both sides and felt an unfamiliar distance from them all, because neither side was asking the question that mattered to him. What would George want? That question haunted him through sleepless nights. He imagined his son growing older, discovering that his own family had debated whether his biology made him acceptable. He imagined the damage that silence could do when it finally broke. The king watched his son struggle and recognized something he had never been allowed to express himself: doubt, not in duty but in tradition. For the first time in his reign, he allowed himself to question whether continuity required sameness. The confirmation that would later be announced to the public did not originate as a press strategy. It began as an ethical reckoning. happening. The palace legal counsel warned that any statement would have to be precise. Words like confirmation, review, and assurance would need to be chosen carefully. There could be no mention of genetic specifics, no medical labels, no history lessons, but William insisted on one inclusion. The statement would affirm Prince George's full standing in the line of succession without qualification. It would not apologize. It would not explain. It would not be obscure. It would declare. This decision was not unanimous. Several senior figures expressed concern that such a declaration would invite further questions. William responded with a sentence that ended the discussion. If we do not say it plainly, they will assume we mean the opposite. As drafts circulated, the tension inside the palace grew sharper. The staff sensed it. Security protocols were tightened. Conversations were shorter. Eyes lingered too long on closed doors. Outside the gates, nothing appeared different. Inside, everything had shifted. The bloodline question was no longer theoretical. It had become personal, political, and irreversible. And at the center of it stood a child who knew nothing of markers, myths, or monarchy. Only that his father looked at him now with a mixture of fierce love and unspoken grief. Because William understood something the palace was only beginning to accept. The crown could survive truth, but only if it stopped fearing it. William breaks. William had always believed that breaking would be loud. He imagined it as shouting doors slammed, voices raised in rooms where portraits watched in judgment. He imagined anger or defiance or some dramatic refusal that would finally force history to look him in the eye. What actually broke him was quieter than any of that. It happened on an ordinary afternoon in mid-February when the palace had returned to a carefully rehearsed calm. The statement was still being refined. Advisors were still debating commas and clauses. Outside the gates, the press sensed movement but could not yet name it. Inside, William sat alone in a small private room rarely used for anything official. There were no files open in front of him, no drafts, no medical reports, only a single photograph he had taken himself years earlier. George, at 4 years old, laughing with his head thrown back, completely unguarded. William stared at it longer than he realized. What undid him was not fear for the future throne. It was grief for a childhood that had already been altered without his son knowing. A childhood now threaded invisibly with adult anxieties and institutional calculations. He thought of the moment he had agreed to the test, how he had told himself it was about protection, about foresight, about love. Now he saw the other truth. He had invited the crown into his son's body. That realization hollowed him out. The physician had cleared him physically after the collapse. Exhaustion, acute stress, reaction, dehydration, nothing that could not be managed. But there was no language for what was happening internally. William was not ill. He was unraveling. Catherine noticed it first in the evenings. He would sit beside her, but not with her. His eyes followed George and Charlotte and Louis with a vigilance that bordered on panic. When George scraped his knee, William reacted as though it were catastrophic. When George grew quiet, William searched his face for signs that did not exist. One night, Catherine placed her hand over his and said gently, "You cannot protect him by watching him disappear." That sentence landed harder than any briefing. William began to pull away from advisors. Meetings shortened. His responses grew clipped. When pressed for decisions, he asked for more time, not because he needed it, but because he feared the moment when time would run out. The king observed all of this with a familiar ache. He recognized the posture. He had worn it himself decades earlier when confronted with choices that pitted the institution against the child. He requested a private meeting with his son, not as monarch, but as father. They met without aides, without papers, without ceremony. The king did not begin with reassurance. He did not speak of duty or strength or legacy. He said something unexpected. "I failed you in ways you were never allowed to name." William looked up sharply. The king continued. He spoke of his own childhood shaped by expectation and silence, of moments when vulnerability had been treated as inconvenience, of lessons learned too early that love within the monarchy was conditional even when it pretended otherwise. He did not excuse it. He named it. William felt something inside him finally give way. He told his father what he had not told anyone else, that he was terrified not of scandal but of repetition, that he could see how easily the palace could rationalize decisions that harmed children while convincing itself it was acting responsibly, that he feared one day George would sit across from him and ask why he had not stopped it. The king listened without interruption. When When William finished, his voice broke not into tears but into something colder. "I cannot let them turn him into a problem to be solved." That was the moment when the breaking became resolved. William stood up from that meeting differently than when he entered. He was still shaken, still exhausted, but something had hardened in him. A line had been drawn internally and it could not be erased. He returned to Kensington Palace and asked for the final draft of the statement. He read it slowly once, then again. On the third reading, he crossed out an entire paragraph. The advisors protested immediately. They warned that removing that language would leave the statement exposed, that it would invite interpretation rather than contain it. William responded calmly. Containment is what caused this. He rewrote the central passage himself, not in legal language, not in medical euphemisms, in plain institutional clarity. The palace confirms that recent genetic analysis concerning Prince George has been completely reviewed and verified. These findings do not alter his health standing, his future responsibilities, or his place in the line of succession. No explanation, no apology, no justification. When the advisors objected again, William looked at them and said something that chilled the room. "If we speak as though there is something to forgive, they will assume there is something to fear." That night, William finally slept, but his dreams were restless. He dreamed of corridors lined with portraits whose eyes followed him, of doors that opened onto rooms filled with children whose names had been removed from history. He woke before dawn and went to George's room. George stirred and opened his eyes, smiling when he saw his father. He asked a simple question: "Why are you so sad?" William sat on the edge of the bed and for a moment considered how easily he could lie. He could say work or tired or grown-up worries, all the excuses he himself had been given. Instead, he chose truth without burden. "I am not sad about you. I am fierce about you." George accepted this answer with the easy trust of a child. He rolled over and went back to sleep. William stayed until the sun rose. By mid-morning, the statement was ready. The king approved it without amendment. He did not offer commentary. He simply nodded. The palace released it shortly after midday. The reaction was immediate and volatile. Headlines screamed confirmation without context. Commentators speculated wildly, filling the vacuum with fear, fantasy, and projection. Social media churned with theories and half-truths and invented histories. But beneath the noise, something unexpected happened. A quieter response emerged. Parents, educators, medical professionals, people who recognized themselves in the language of variance rather than defect. They spoke not of scandal but of recognition. William watched it unfold with guarded attention. He did not feel relief, but he felt aligned. The breaking had not destroyed him. It had clarified him. For the first time since the envelope arrived at dawn, he understood what his role truly was: not to protect the crown from the truth, but to protect his son from the crown when necessary. And that understanding would change everything that came next. What the palace confirmed. The palace had issued confirmations before: death, engagements, abdications, illnesses, births. Each one calibrated to preserve calm while revealing just enough to satisfy the moment. This confirmation was different from the instant it left the gates. It was shorter than expected, flatter in tone, and absent the usual cushioning language that softened uncomfortable truths. That absence was intentional. Within minutes of release, senior correspondents began calling contacts who could not answer them. Medical commentators scanned the phrasing, looking for clues that were not there. Constitutional experts reread the line about succession again and again, as if repetition might expose a hidden caveat. It did not. The palace had confirmed 3 things and refused to elaborate on all of them. That genetic analysis had taken place, that it had been reviewed and verified, that it changed nothing. In refusing to explain, the palace had done something rare. It had forced the public to confront its own assumptions. Speculation surged precisely because detail was withheld, but as the hours passed, the narrative fractured. Without a central story to cling to, the noise could not sustain itself. Each theory contradicted the next. Each expert undermined another. What remained consistent was the line the palace refused to soften. Prince George's place in the line of succession remains unchanged. That sentence became the axis around which everything turned. Behind the scenes, the confirmation triggered a second wave of reckoning, not with the public, but within the institution itself. Departments that had spent decades managing perception suddenly found themselves without a script. There was no precedent for confirming something without contextualizing it. No guide for standing still while the world searched for movement. Some saw this as failure, others saw it as restraint. The king convened a final internal council not to debate the statement but to discuss its consequences. He spoke plainly. The palace would not issue follow-ups, It would not engage in clarification interviews. It would not brief anonymously. Silence would be maintained unless the welfare of the child demanded otherwise. This decision unsettled those who believed authority depended on constant explanation. But the king had come to understand something William already knew. The more the palace spoke, the more it invited distortion. William did not attend the council. He was with George at the time, helping him with homework that had nothing to do with history or monarchy. When the call came, confirming the public release, he acknowledged it and returned to the table. George asked him what confirmation meant. William paused. He chose his words carefully. "It means that sometimes grown-ups tell the truth without telling a story about it." George nodded as if this made perfect sense. Later that evening, William watched the coverage for the first time. He saw his son's name paired with words like revelation, shock, and collapse. He felt a flicker of anger at the dramatization of his own physical reaction, but he also understood it. People needed an image to process what they could not define. What the palace had confirmed was not a diagnosis. It was not a weakness. It was not a scandal. It was an end to denial. For generations, the monarchy had relied on silence to maintain the illusion that the crown was untouched by the full spectrum of human variation. That illusion had been punctured not by exposure but by acknowledgement. The confirmation did not say what the genetic marker was, but it did something more destabilizing. It implied that such markers had always existed. Advocacy groups began drawing connections not to George specifically, but to history. They questioned how many stories of fragile princes and difficult heirs had been shaped by misunderstanding rather than incapacity. Academics revisited old case studies with fresh eyes. The palace did not respond. Internally, some staff struggled. Those who had built careers on managing narrative felt unmoored. Others quietly expressed relief. One junior aide remarked that for the first time the palace sounded like it was telling the truth without asking permission. William received messages he never expected, from parents of children who had been quietly redirected away from opportunity, from adults who had grown up believing something was wrong with them because institutions could not accommodate differences. He read them alone late at night. None of them mentioned the throne. They mentioned dignity. The confirmation had shifted something fundamental. It had reframed strength not as uniformity but as continuity through difference. The monarchy had not collapsed under the revelation. It had absorbed it. That absorption did not feel triumphant. It felt heavy, because confirmation carried responsibility. William understood now that protecting George would not mean shielding him from attention forever. It would mean teaching him to exist openly without apology, to inherit not just a crown but a corrected story. The palace had confirmed what it could no longer hide, that the future king would not be defined by myth, only by truth. The air after the silence. The silence that followed was not empty. It was deliberately shaped and held in place by choice rather than fear. The palace did not retreat, but it did not advance either. It allowed the moment to settle into history without forcing it to perform. For William, this silence became a boundary. Inside it, he rebuilt something quieter and stronger than certainty. He stopped reading commentary. He declined briefings that offered to translate public mood into strategy. Instead, he focused on rhythm. School mornings, bedtime routines, questions answered without evasion, but without weight. George sensed the shift without understanding its cause. His father laughed more easily now. Not loudly, but honestly. The vigilance softened into presence. One afternoon in early March, George asked a question that caught William off guard. "Will I still be king someday?" William did not hesitate. Yes. There was no explanation attached to the word, no conditions, no reassurance beyond the truth of it. George accepted the answer and returned to his game. That ease was the inheritance William wanted to preserve. The palace began to recalibrate quietly, not through announcements but through practice. Language shifted in internal documents. Training expanded. Advisors were brought in not to manage differences but to understand it. The institution adjusted without fanfare. It was not perfect, it never would be, but it was moving. The king watched this transformation with a mixture of relief and regret. He understood that something had been lost with the old illusions. But he also recognized that something sturdier had replaced them. Legacy no longer meant unbroken sameness. It meant continuity with truth intact. Months later, historians would debate the moment endlessly. They would argue whether the confirmation marked a weakening or a modernization, whether silence had been strategic or accidental, whether the monarchy had changed or merely survived. None of that mattered to William. What mattered was that his son would grow up knowing that nothing in his blood made him less worthy of what lay ahead. The air after the silence was not diminished. He was clearer, and for the first time in generations the crown would pass not through denial but through acceptance. That was the revelation that endured, not collapse, but correction. If this story changed how you see power, legacy, and truth within the monarchy, let us know your thoughts below. Your voice matters here. Subscribe for deeper royal stories, hidden histories, and the moments the palace never once explained. Like this video if you felt the weight of this revelation, and share it with someone who understands that silence can shape history just as much as crowns do.